Where do we go when we die? A question as old as the human race itself. Some find contentment in the belief of a paradise awaiting the faithful and punishment awaiting the sinners, while others find peace in the idea that there's nothing after death. Lights on, lights off. The truth is far worse. At the end of it all, both sinner and saint, true believer or heathen, we all go down to Deadside. There, in the barren wastes of Deadside, most of us will go on to join the wailing, worn down by an endless march until there is nothing left of your soul but another empty husk, shrieking in despair till the end of time. Our world, Liveside, exists in a fragile balance with Deadside. One man alone is charged with maintaining that balance and to bring those miserable souls in Deadside a modicum of peace. He is the Shadow Man. Shadow Man, with no space between Shadow and Man yet, was created in 1992 by Jim Shooter, Steve Englehart, and Dave Lapham as part of new publisher Valiant Comics' burgeoning shared universe. Jack Boniface was just another sax player looking to leave his mark on Bourbon Street until the night he was gifted the powers of the Shadow Man, filling him with an unquenchable hunger to punish the wicked of New Orleans. From there, his story steadily evolves from Batman-esque street vigilantism to epic battles with supernatural forces that seek to engulf the world. In short, Shadow Man is one of the best creations of the horrible, childishly edgy era in comics that was the 90s. At the time, the book sold very well for Valiant, being popular enough for New Orleans Mayor Sidney Barthélemy to proclaim January 17th as Shadow Man Day, not even a full year into the comic's publication. Sadly, Jack Boniface seemed to just slip through the cracks when the speculator boom ended, and now hardly gets any mention these days. Another great example of how people only looking back on the 90s to clown on Rob Liefeld are missing out on good comics from the era. You know, unless you can seriously tell me that a voodoo-themed vigilante beating the shit out of drug dealers, racist rednecks, and occult forces alike doesn't sound awesome. Then a few years later, Acclaim, yes, that Acclaim, decided that they wanted to get into comics and bought Valiant, right around the time when the floor was caving in on the industry. This buyout necessitated a reboot of every Valiant comic that they planned on turning into a video game, Shadow Man included, because it wouldn't be a story about comics without an unnecessary reboot along the way. For this reboot, Acclaim brought in Australian artist Ashley Wood, whose brilliant work created an appropriately surreal, otherworldly vibe to the new Shadow Man, who now had a space in his name between Shadow and Man for no real reason. On the writing end, Acclaim commissioned Garth Ennis, and without me saying another word, every comic fan listening just had either a very positive or negative reaction to me saying that name. To get everyone not familiar with comics up to speed, Garth Ennis is the creator of Preacher and The Boys. He's equally well known for his compelling take on the Punisher with Punisher Max, which heavily influenced John Bernthal's take on the character. So, with 3 comics that have in some way been adapted into acclaimed television, what's the big deal? Well, the thing is, Garth Ennis fucking hates superheroes. He hates them to a frankly hysterical degree, to the point where he believes bizarre things like Captain America defames real World War II veterans with his very existence. This hatred leads to things like in the comics version of The Boys, the Captain America stand-in wets himself at the sight of real combat, is repeatedly sexually assaulted, and then brutally killed.
Call my therapist. Tell him he's a rich man.
Oh, you thought the TV show was dark? Nah. The TV show is what you get when actually mature adults write something like The Boys. Move him away from superheroes, though, with something like Preacher, or give him a Punisher continuity where superheroes don't exist, and suddenly Garth Ennis is a brilliant writer. It's the damnedest thing. And by some miracle, this is the Garth Ennis Acclaim got. In 4 issues, he completely reinvents Shadow Man into an amnesiac hitman named Zero, who spends most of his time staring at a teddy bear when he isn't out killing people. Though once he's granted the powers of the Shadow Man by the voodoo priestess Mama Nettie, parts of his memory begin to return. Slowly, and with the help of Jaunty, a smart-mouthed skull with a snake's body and a thick Irish accent, Zero begins to piece his past together. This take on Shadow Man is fantastic, and I would recommend it to anyone had Ennis and Wood not left after issue 4. Almost none of this info is actually needed to play today's game, mind you. My main intention with this preamble was to give you an idea of how intriguing I think that both Jack Boniface and Michael Lewa are, and how I think it's a shame that Shadow Man is such an obscure property. Though it's not very comfortable up on this high horse of mine, considering that I still haven't picked up any of the new Shadow Man books that came out once Valiant rose from the grave. Well, I think I've talked about comics enough. Let's get on to the game you clicked on this video for. Originally released in 1999 for the N64, PS1, Dreamcast, and PC by Acclaim, Shadow Man fared reasonably well with critics and sold enough for a sequel, Shadow Man 2 Second Coming, to be released 3 years later. Acclaim, being their usual classy selves, promoted said sequel by offering to pay people to have an advertisement chiseled into their loved ones' headstones. In a beautiful bit of irony, Acclaim would be needing a headstone itself 2 years later. For this video, I played the re-release done by Nightdive Studios, Shadow Man Remastered. I swear I'm not trying to make this channel into a Nightdive-centric one. They just happen to be one of the only companies out there who put real effort into remastering games instead of slapping their logo on an emulated copy and calling it a day. In fact, Nightdive went to the trouble of rebuilding the game in their Kex engine using the source code of Shadow Man's PS1 port, which makes it all the more impressive that they used the version everyone hated and still crafted the definitive version of this game. Now, while I have played the original PC version in the past, I never made it far enough to be able to provide comparisons on what all is different between it and Remastered. The only thing I do know for sure is that two bosses who previously shared the same location with a third one have been given entirely new levels all to themselves. That's the Nightdive difference. You know, until fake Atari fucks it all up. Anyways, the story begins in 1888 where the infamous serial killer Jack the Ripper is met by a mysterious man named Legion. Legion promises Jack great powers so long as he constructs an asylum in Deadside in Legion's name. Jack, being, you know, Jack the fucking Ripper, eagerly offs himself as a sacrifice to his new lord. In the present, Nettie, oh goody, they kept the sex with Michael keeps her forever young angle from the post-Ennis run! Nettie has been having foreboding dreams about Legion's plan to bring about the apocalypse with the power of the Dark Souls. Resist the easy jokes, Mike. Resist them! With the threat emanating from down Deadside way, only the Shadow Man can stop Legion. It won't be an easy task, though. First, Michael will have to defeat Legion's 5 acolytes, each one a vicious serial killer fused with a dark soul that both empowers them and allows them to exist in Liveside as well as Deadside. In addition to Jack the Ripper, there's the Lizard King, Victor Batrachian, a failed doctor who posed as a GP in order to kill wealthy widows, Repo Man Marco Cruz, a former Repo Man and DJ who would run his victims off the road and abduct them before committing his murders, the video nasty killer Milton Pike, a sadist who would tape his killings and then send them to the police to taunt them, and the home improvement killer Avery Marks, a sick monster known for building the furniture in his own home out of the skin of his victims. Honestly, the most terrifying part of Shadow Man is the dossier you're given, which profiles each man in the style of a real police report. All of their crimes are based on real-life serial killers with only a smidge of the supernatural added to blunt the grisly reality of their crimes. I'd recommend avoiding reading these entries if you're squeamish. I'm of two minds on this. On the one hand, it's kind of extremely tasteless to have this file which uses the horrific deaths of real people as inspiration for what is essentially just background fluff for a supernatural horror game. On the other hand, I can't act as if this isn't a common thing in horror. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre is one of the finest horror movies ever created, and it took inspiration from Ed Gein to serve as the basis for Leatherface, a source that Shadow Man also drew upon for Avery Marks. I suppose it wouldn't be horror if it didn't cross the boundaries of good taste once, twice, or even 17 times. There's a game buried in here somewhere, right? I should probably get to talking about that at some point. Shadow Man comes from the time in console gaming when Tomb Raider dominated the landscape and Rare still made platformers. It's with that in mind that I feel the easiest way to describe Shadow Man's gameplay is to say that it's as if a classic Tomb Raider game were structured like Banjo-Kazooie. You have your main hub area that branches out through passages that require you to have collected enough Dark Souls in order to progress. And here I thought there were only 3 of no, bad Mike. No taking the low-hanging fruit. These Govi holding the Dark Souls can only be broken open with Mike's powers. This Mike, not me, Mike. However, because the Shadow Man is a being of darkness, Mike can't use these powers during the day. So no breaking the ones in Live Side open until after dark. Or, since time is a factor here, Mike could use an ancient dark magic ritual, one that I'm pretty sure I'd have to censor if the graphics were any better, to force an eclipse to happen and cast enough darkness to allow him to use his powers. The largest chunk of Shadow Man's gameplay is exploring various spooky locales across Deadside until you've gained enough Dark Souls and upgrades to confront the Five. You'll also face down every other threat Deadside and Legion's Asylum can throw at you. Though you'll steadily accrue an arsenal of weapons and voodoo magic, your main weapon for your entire playthrough will be Mike's starting pistol. At first, it doesn't deal much damage even with a boost to Shadow Man powers in Deadside, which turns it into the Shadow Gun, but as you collect Dark Souls, you'll be able to charge shots up for longer and longer until most enemies will be going down in 2 to 3 shots. The pistol is also the only weapon in the game that will cause enemies to drop health when they die. This makes it essential to learn how to use the pistol well, because Shadow Man throws enough enemies at you that they will chip away at your health. It's also the only weapon with infinite ammo, so there's that too. That doesn't mean the rest of the weapons are useless, especially seeing as how you can dual wield whichever combo you'd like. The Violator, not that Violator, that's not even the right comic publisher, though I'm not opposed to a Shadow Man and Spawn crossover. No, Shadow Man's Violator is akin to Quake's nail gun, a rapid-fire weapon that eats through ammo quickly if you aren't paying attention. Because it was crafted in the Asylum, it's the only firearm besides Mike's gun that can be used in both Live Side and Deadside. This makes it quite handy against tougher enemies that the pistol can't take down quite as easily. Outside of bosses, the other firearms aren't quite as handy due to being limited to Live Side, which you won't be spending a lot of time in during your playtime. The only times you'll find yourself in Live Side will be because either you're heading to face off with one of the Five, or because you need to hop back to Louisiana to talk with Nettie. They're also just not all that interesting compared to the supernatural weaponry you'll find. As you progress through Deadside, though, you'll discover more and more voodoo weapons powered by Shadow Man's magic. That would be this yellow meter here. The more Dark Souls you collect, the longer this meter extends. Apologies in advance for my likely terrible pronunciation of these names, by the way. French words are tricky for me to remember how to say to begin with. It's even harder when the word belongs to a Creole. Not to mention that these words are likely pronounced differently depending on whether we're talking Haitian voodoo or New Orleans voodoo. First up is the Asan, a human skull and vertebrae, presumably removed Predator style, that shoots fireballs. Useful at the start, but saw absolutely zero use after I found the Flambeau. The Flambeau is the souped up version of the Asan that ups the damage to massive degrees at the cost of having a short range. But since nearly every enemy in the game that would require using the Flambeau attacks you at close range, this isn't nearly the drawback it might sound like. The Flambeau can also burn through these tapestries made from human skin. How lovely. These tapestries often hide cadeaux, the other collectible in Shadow Man. Once you have 100 of them, you can offer these cadeaux at altars inside the Fire Temple to boost your maximum health, while Mike seriously hams it up about how good he feels afterwards.
The life force fills me with its savage fire.
Do I make you horny, baby? Yeah, do I?
Next up is the baton, which, while it can be used as a weapon, I mostly used for its secondary feature of warping between these ether altars. Then we have the Enseigne. Being a shield, this one doesn't have any offensive purpose, but I'll be damned if it isn't the most useful part of your magic arsenal. So long as you have enough magic left, the Enseigne will block every attack that comes your way. And since you can continue attacking with the weapon in your other hand, this is indispensable in boss encounters. If you can time it correctly, you can even extend the amount of time you can block by only activating it just before an attack hits. In short, the Enseigne is the best superhero shield this side of Captain America. After the Enseigne is the Marteau, a jawbone swung like a hammer that shoots out homing fireballs. Maybe it's because of how late in the game I found it, but I never used the Marteau all that much. By then, the Shadow Gun was strong enough that I was taking down most enemies with ease. Like with the baton, I used the Marteau more for its secondary function, in this case pounding 3 drums to remove a nearby barrier. Finally, there's the Calabash. Thanks to living in the South for 11 years now, the first thing that springs to mind for me when I hear the word Calabash is Calabash chicken. Though delicious, it has nothing to do with this Calabash. The Calabash you'll have access to in Shadow Man functions as your Morph Ball bomb, right down to using it to break certain objects blocking your path. In Shadow Man's case, it's these tiles emblazoned with the Veve of Papa Legba. However, I'm not sure if that has any symbolic meaning in the context of the game, or if the developers just looked up voodoo symbols and picked one they thought looked cool. Actually, considering the era, it's almost certainly the latter. Combat feels very good, generally speaking. Thanks to Remastered utilizing the innovation that is the second analog stick, you won't have trouble keeping enemies in your sights while letting the quality auto-aim do its thing. If you're feeling brave, you can even switch to a first-person view for manual aiming. In another plus for the combat, the way enemies explode in a flash of light after a final shot from the shadow gun never gets old. It's a satisfying finale for tough battles. Meanwhile, on the platforming end, though it takes a backseat to the combat, platforming controls much better than many others from this era. Back in the day, it was often a choice of good platforming controls at the expense of combat that felt good, or vice versa, especially in games so clearly inspired by the original Tomb Raiders. In comparison, I never felt once while playing Shadow Man that I failed a jump because of shoddy controls or a hostile camera. To any youngins watching this video, you don't realize how good we have it now with video game cameras. There were no rules, no standards back in the 90s. I played more than one game as a child that made me think its camera was possessed by a demon intent on ensuring I failed. Joke's on that demon though, I sucked so hard at games back then that even the best camera controls couldn't have helped me. If there was one problem I had with platforming in Shadow Man, it was that sometimes I couldn't quite see certain ledges I needed to jump to. That could just as easily be a result of me being me, though. Lucky for my dumb ass, death is a slap on the wrist in Shadow Man. What with being the Lord of Deadside and all, it's not exactly possible for Mike to truly die. Instead, you'll just be sent back to the entrance of the area if you die in Deadside, or you'll get sent back to Deadside if you die in Liveside. Sort of like another series involving Dark Souls.
Boy, is he laying it on thick.
If even that is still too much punishment for your liking, you can also save anywhere you like and load from there. I'd recommend at least doing this before boss battles, if for no other reason than trekking all the way back through an empty level can get grating after a while. Speaking of boss battles, well, they're certainly present. The levels surrounding them are all great and chock full of atmosphere. Special praise goes to Avery Marks' Tenement of Nightmares and Jack the Ripper's abandoned section of the London Underground set to a warped version of Moonlight Sonata. What is it about that number that works so well for horror? Anyways, the fights themselves aren't anything special. Fill them full of buckshot, then finish them off with the shadow gun. Rinse and repeat 4 more times on your way to facing off against Legion. I wouldn't call it bad design, but it didn't wow me either. Like I said, these boss fights are present. They're there to tick off a typical video game requirement, with more thought put into the levels around them than the fights themselves. Atmosphere is the glue that holds Shadow Man together. It's a tricky balance in a more action-oriented horror game to give the player plenty of tools to fight back with, while remaining unsettling. A good portion of horror comes from a sense of helplessness, and Michael Lavoie is anything but helpless. Yet somehow, the developers at Acclaim's Deadside Studio found a way to maintain an unnerving atmosphere with a combination of visceral imagery and an ambient soundtrack that will make your skin crawl. The Shadow Man may not be helpless in a place like this, but he's the only one who isn't. A fact that the recurring presence of the Wailing is keen to remind you of. My talk at the start about the nature of the afterlife in the Shadow Man universe is the canon used by this game as well as Garth Ennis' run. This esoterically terrifying concept specifically comes from the Deadside spin-off written by Paul Jenkins. I make no exaggeration when I say that Deadside number 2 bothered me for such a long time after reading it. The idea of there being nothing after death but a long march into despair whereupon your identity is eroded from your soul and replaced by a pallid, wailing husk is far more terrifying to me than any fire and brimstone hell. Sadly, this atmospheric presentation didn't extend to the quality of the story. Naturally, this will involve spoilers, so let's get a warning up here.
The spoiler, remember.
There we go. Skip on forward to this point if you want to avoid spoilers. Okay, so structurally, I don't have an issue with Shadow Man's story. On a basic level, it gives a solid enough reason why everything is happening and what your goal is. Shadow Man's problems come more in the execution of so many scenes, which wind up hurting the finished product. Some of this can be chalked up to wanting to do more with scenes than the technology of the era would allow, like whatever the hell happens here right before the fight with Batrachian. But the main stumbling block is in the voice acting, or perhaps more accurately, the voice direction. For example, Michael's VA, Red Pepper, whose name is awesome, is a good casting choice. His deep baritone provides the kind of believability to a badass like Mike without coming off as detached or emotionless.
Hey, anything's possible, Doc. You, above all people, should know that. I'm sorry. Did I call you people? My mistake. You aren't a person at all, are you? Are you?
It's just that there are several moments where it feels like he wasn't given proper context for the scene, so his delivery doesn't land like it should.
I don't drink with snakes.
Despite what people may think, you can't just drop a voice actor in the booth and get a perfect line read. They need context and proper direction the same as any actor. One who could be there to tell Lani Minella that she's overplaying Nettie's accent to an uncomfortable degree.
Because that's impossible. Their power is their immortality. If evil ever manages to implant these immortal souls into its monstrous slaves, can you imagine the carnage an immortal, unbeatable army would bring to the earth? That's Apocalypse, Shadow Man. That's the end.
I'm not exactly sure where I stand on the issue of minority characters not being voiced by someone of the same ethnicity. I'd have a hard time imagining Samurai Jack not being voiced by Phil Lamar, for example.
When does the magic begin? There's no magic, is there?
But when it comes to performances like this, I do confess to feeling awkward. Obviously, I don't think Lani Minella or anyone else involved in the production intended anything bad with Nettie, and I don't want to hear about anyone deciding to harass them over it. That is never okay. However, a lack of malicious intent doesn't stop Nettie from coming off as slightly insensitive. Not helping things is that Minella plays the accent so broadly that honestly, it makes Nettie sound Jamaican to me.
They are the heralds for the apocalypse, opening the way for the armies of the damned, the power of the dark souls unleashed upon the earth.
Go on, no man. Don't you know nothing about zipping up a woman's frock?
Now, Nettie is shown in the comics to possess a noticeable accent, but if memory serves me right, it's never narrowed down beyond her clearly being from a place that practiced some derivative of West African voodoo. Normally, Lani Minella is a great voice actress with incredible range. Would you believe me if I told you that the same woman voices Ivy in Soul Calibur, Eve from Mass Effect 3, Luke in Professor Layton, a good chunk of the female characters in Skyrim, and Nancy Drew? The fact that the game credits her as Lonnie Millenni makes me think that she probably doesn't look too fondly on this performance either. I don't think that's a typo either, because surely Remastered would have fixed it in that case, right? That actually caused me to think at first that this was just a similarly named actress. But I couldn't find evidence of a voice actress named Lonnie Millenni existing outside of Shadow Man's credits. I suppose even the greatest of actors have dud performances. The voices for the rest of Shadow Man's characters vary in quality. Mainly because outside of Marco Cruz and Milton Pike being played by Corey Johnson, who does a good job with both.
Get back out now! Fox Chicken and your number's coming up. You need to mark 5 verse 9 and Echo Foxtrot, shall we dance?
You're gonna find out what survival is all about. Just like a rerun of the Nam.
The remainder of the cast are all voiced by members of the dev team or presumably their relatives. This inconsistency can happen with the same performer, too. Guy Miller does a decent job as Victor Batrachian.
Do you know who I am? Do you?
You're a little puppy dog.
Don't call me that! I am Dr. Death! I am the Lizard King! Can't you see what I've accomplished here?
But he falls far short of the menace needed for Legion.
And he replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many."
And Simon Phipps clearly had the time of his life as Avery Marks.
Come to mama now, baby. Sweet baby, come to mama. For we are many.
But his Jack the Ripper feels a bit bland.
And now I have returned as a bloody messiah, an avatar resurrected, a divine servant for my master's great plan.
And I still don't know how I feel about Barry Mead's Jaunty.
He's been filling your head with our fated pillow talk again, I'll bet. Doomsday in an army giddy until you're drunk with the stuff.
Which sucks because he was one of the highlights of the Ennis comics. I don't know if it's the timing, the delivery, or both, but something in there keeps Jaunty's jokes from landing with me.
Is that Peter Brigel?
No, Seamus, his distant Irish cousin.
The strangest choice to me was in casting an actual child as Mike's little brother Luke. To this kid's credit, he does a good job for the creepy little sound bites that pop up at moments, like when you quick travel with the teddy bear.
Come on, Slowpoke.
It's when he has to deliver entire lines of dialogue that it falls apart.
Hiya, Mikey. Glad you could make it. I've been waiting for you. I was scared. Scared they were gonna catch me. That you weren't gonna come get me.
If professional adult voice actors were having trouble with their delivery, what hope did a child have? It wasn't even necessary to have him show up as anything but a haunting vision. In fact, the whole plot point of Mike believing that his little brother's alive is so poorly done. Players unfamiliar with the source material will barely understand who the hell this kid is or why Mike is shocked to see him. And players who are familiar with the source material will be questioning why the hell Mike thinks this is actually Luke in the first place. Why is he the same age he was when he died in the car accident years prior? How has a living person with no powers survived Deadside? When would Legion have had the time to abduct Luke and bring him to the asylum? And most of all, does this look infected to you? It's too bad that it's so blindingly obvious that Luke isn't real, because some of Red Pepper's best line reads come right at the scene where Mike thinks he's reunited with Luke.
Oh God, I'm sorry, Luke.
It's just so hard to appreciate in the moment because you're sitting there going, it's Legion, it's so obviously Legion.
You ain't Luke. You ain't my brother.
Congratulations! You win the booby prize.
Many of these issues are a sign of the era Shadow Man was made in. Back in the late 90s, companies like Acclaim would stretch their budgets as far as they could while forcing their developers to crunch the whole way. Voice acting done quickly and on the cheap was the standard.
Who wants to make $5?
And despite ambitions to become something more, narratives were often held back by technology and time constraints. In my opinion, if this game, with the same development team mind you, had a publisher that was even a tiny iota less negligent than Acclaim, then Shadow Man would have been a contender for Game of the Year status in its time. If the dev team had only been given the time for one more pass at polishing things, to re-record some lines or maybe rethink certain characterizations, I'd be sitting here talking about a bona fide classic. Shadow Man is a game that straddles the line between good and great. It leans so close into the territory of greatness, only to be yanked back into just being good by the rough execution of its story and inconsistent voice acting. If you can look past that issue, however, Shadow Man is a rock-solid action horror game polished as best as Nightdive could with the remastered version. The tense atmosphere, engaging exploration, and fun combat kept me entertained the whole way through. If you enjoy games like the classic Tomb Raiders and would like to try something along the same lines with more horror elements to it, I believe this is a game worth checking out. As for the Shadow Man himself, the property vanished for a time after Acclaim shuttered their comics division, only to make an unexpected comeback with the rest of Valiant Comics in 2012 with Jack Boniface back in the title role. And it's still going strong and getting new issues published to this day. It even got a neat concept album from the metal band A Sound of Thunder called Tales from the Deadside that's based on the Revival's continuity. It's pretty good, though I do wish there were more jazz elements to the song. It feels wrong to have an album about Jack Boniface and not include some saxophone. I'm not saying that it needed a whole sax solo like Rivers of Nihil's Where Owls Know My Name, but... No, actually, that's exactly what it needed. Incidentally, check out Rivers of Nihil sometime. Where Owls Know My Name and The Work are modern metal masterpieces. In regard to other Shadow Man related developments, supposedly a movie is in the works, but that's been rumored for almost as long as I've been alive. I'll believe it when I see it. That they decided to lead with fucking Bloodshot does not inspire confidence in Valiant's film division.
Oh, that really isn't very nice of you, you know. If you had any real friends, you wouldn't be such a grump.
Best of all, though, a new game based on the Revival's continuity was recently announced, Shadow Man Dark Legacy. Very little has been revealed as of now, and it seems to be a bit outside of developer Blowfish Studios' wheelhouse, but for now I'm trying to be hopeful that Shadow Man will get another opportunity in the eyes of players, and that with any luck, Jack Boniface will get a game at least as good as the one Michael Lewa got. Well, that's it for this one. I'll see you next time.
Nettie said that only a Shadow Man or something more powerful could release a dark soul from a Govi.
TV repairman, man.